All right, let's go ahead and get started in the interest of time. My name is Brittany Ares. I'm part of the Battery Park City Neighborhood Association. I'm here with a few others, Kelly McGowan, and others in the Neighborhood Association, as well as Battery Park City residents in the community. We are joined, and who will speak the bulk of this time, by our wonderful alternate design team, a team of experts that helped with the original design of Wagner and have graciously volunteered their time, their expertise, their heart and soul, really, to help preserve our park for our community for generations to come. They have dedicated their time, taken time off of their family vacations to work with us, fully pro bono, and we are forever grateful for them, for their help. So tonight you will see, you go to the next slide, Cleta. We'll give you first a preview of what this alternate design looks like for Wagner Park in Lower Manhattan. We'll flash up our introductions of our wonderful independent committee of experts, and they will take you through some history of Battery Park, of Wagner Park, its historical significance, and then talk about the alternate design itself. And then at the end, we will have time for Q&A, questions, feedback, etc. So flipping forward, this new alternate design, this will, number one, protect from sea level rise and storm surge. It will help protect from cloudburst flooding, so flooding from the sky. Has the opportunity to add green space with minimal disruption in a way that will provide protection quicker, more flexibly as science evolves. And it will do what we've been asking for from the beginning, which is to leave the park intact, not to raise the park, preserve mature trees, and prioritize green over concrete. So that's what this alternate design will do. The next slide. As a reminder for those in the community, this is the Battery Park City Authority's plan. It is a much bigger pavilion in size. It has maximum impact to the park, to the character of the neighborhood, reduces green space, results in 114 trees, mature trees, being demolished. And according to the city, in the last CB1 meeting, does not address flooding from the sky. What you can notice here is, if you look at that top picture, that's what you're going to see when you're standing on the street. You see the little person right there. You'll be looking, instead of looking at the Statue of Liberty, which is what Cindy and Jeffrey will walk you through, you will see just a big wall essentially standing right in front of you. So all the views and sight lines that were so carefully crafted to the Statue of Liberty are going to be blocked by this larger structure. So you go to the next slide, Cleta, please. So there's an alternate plan. Again, this alternate plan will provide equal protection with additional flexibility. So as science evolves, and if you need more height to protect from storm surge, this alternate plan can accommodate that quite easily. There'll be minimal disruption, and it has the opportunity to increase green space. So with that, let's go on to the next slide and introduce our committee of experts. Next one. So I can't thank this team enough for their time, their expertise, and for really volunteering to help our community get a better resiliency project. We are forever grateful to them for coming to our aid and heeding our calls for help. So I'm going to hand it over to Cindy and to Jeffrey.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brittany. It's an honor to be here this evening to speak to so many people who are interested. There is little doubt that what happens at Wagner Park is a precedent for not only the rest of Battery Park City, but is a precedent for Lower Manhattan and, quite frankly, other communities that are face the same very real threats of sea level rise, increased storms, and storm surge. So I would like to acknowledge my own team from Olin, who has worked alongside of me. Dimos Dorinos, most recently, was the project manager on Pier 26. Jeffrey, if you'd like to introduce your team.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Cindy, and thanks again, Brittany and Kelly, and to the Neighborhood Association for inviting our firm back to Battery Park to help and assist the community in this very important project. I'm a partner at Olin Silvetti. We were the architects of the Pavilion, working with Olin when they designed Wagner Park. Working on my team with me is Tucker Douglas and Taylor Halamka, who have put in a considerable amount of time and consideration into the options and ideas that we'll be presenting today. Cindy?
Great. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm not a stranger to Battery Park City. As a matter of fact, this is the very project that I cut my teeth on as I was coming out of graduate school, working for then Hannah Olin, alongside of notable figures such as Stan Eckstadt and Alex Cooper. It was a real collaboration. And I just want to underscore the importance of Battery Park City. It is a model of urban design. It is kind of the first of its kind. And it really established the precedent for how people thought about urban waterfronts. Next, please. So not only did I cut my teeth on Battery Park City back in the late 70s, early 80s, but I was the project manager for Wagner Park. And what you see on the right, two images, those were, that's what we found here. And you can kind of make out on the left-hand image that there was a helipad on the site of the future Wagner Park. Hannah Olin at the time did work on the design guidelines for the Esplanade. Of course, the considerations were quite different in the late 70s. And we all need to figure out what to do next. And really, that's one of the things that Jeffrey and I are here to talk to you about tonight. But we also think it's important for people to perhaps be exposed to the significance of Wagner Park, which this year, or it opened in '96, so 25 years later, 2021, would actually qualify for an historic register of significant places if it were not being destroyed. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to invite Jeffrey to talk a little bit about what was in the minds of Machado Silvetti. But before I hand it over, I just want to say that kind of messy sketch on the right is a drawing by Lori Olin. We all responded to the significance of the Statue of Liberty and the relationship of this space to the statue. That was kind of a dominant theme. Jeffrey.
Thanks, Cindy. I would just add that the selection of the team back in the early 90s was made by others, including David Emile, the then president of the Battery Park city authority on the advice of many people, but among them Mildred Friedman of the Walker Art Center and Herbert Muschamp of the New York Times architectural critic. And what's significant about this selection was the importance that was placed on this as a cultural project, a project that would have cultural artistic significance for Manhattan, for Battery Park City. We often think as we work on projects like this around the world, everywhere, about the characteristics that make truly great spaces and architecture, which is generally for us a sort of a three-pronged approach. One is an approach that recognizes the uniqueness of a community and what needs are and desires are now and how those needs and desires might emerge. And this is what leads us to a place like Wagner Park and the design of the public space and the open space and the lawn and the plaza and the amphitheater and the area for performance, that this is a park that has grown with and transformed with the community as Battery Park City has developed. The second piece is the idea of place. There is nowhere else in the world where you have this connection to Ellis Island and to the Statue of Liberty. The design of the park and of the pavilions had that singular idea in mind when they were designing. They also, as Cindy will tell you, solved flooding issues and technical issues and drainage issues and planting issues, but there was an idea that was uniquely related to the place. And then finally, great places in architecture tend to have unique characteristics that sometimes come from many places, but sometimes from the hand of the designers who envision them. Cindy will talk a little bit about the planning of the site and the characteristics and shapes of gardens. The pavilions themselves were at the hand of the founding partner of my office, Rodolfo Machado, who was introducing an idea about a relationship between these pavilions and the statue. And on the next slide, you can see this idea manifest actually in the pavilion looking from the water, which is an idea about a colossus partially buried in Manhattan that has a dialogue with the Statue of Liberty looking back at it. This pavilion looks at the statue looks back at Wagner Park, and there's a dialogue between the memories of immigrants, the ideals of America, and the relationship of this idea of Manhattan actually receiving and welcoming people to its borders. This is quite interesting, exciting. This project is very influential in schools of architecture and in schools of thought and in our practice. Cindy?
Sure. Next, please. So this idea of welcoming is kind of permeates the overall design. This was a very tight collaboration between Rodolfo and Jorge from Machado Silvetti, Lori and myself, and Lyndon Miller, who was our horticulturist. It was a project that was unique for the time. It was inventing kind of new forms and inventing sort of a relationship to a very great place. What you see on the right is a collage that we made. Lyndon Miller was very involved in the conservatory gardens in Central Park. And so those two forms at the top on the right are the conservatory gardens. And we were interested in this notion of what happens if you take sort of the principles of a bed and the ability to reach plants, that the bed isn't too deep. What if you take that form and kind of break it open? And so that process of disassembling was very important. And at the bottom two images on the right, you're seeing the gardens flare open. And again, you can see that in the rendered plan on the left. But one of the really critical things is the architecture and the landscape are absolutely knit together here. The flaring of the stairs as you rise up onto the pavilions is very much in alignment with what's happening with the gardens. And so that passageway through the pavilions to the Statue of Liberty, the gardens flaring and embracing and welcoming the Statue of Liberty and framing those two spaces. These were very important ideas. I should also note that there was this idea back in the early stages about the lawn that is in front of the pavilions as being this incredible book, sort of this book of knowledge, this book of democracy. That idea got adopted into the scroll. So the very subtle step sequence down to the water and the form of the lights on either side of those steps is this idea of scroll manuscript independence celebrated in a very subtle way. Next, please. So we all know that something needs to be done. No one in the audience today, nor on the panel today, believes otherwise. The conditions are quite serious. So next. All right. And we all have seen the work of BIG and the Big U, which came out of the post-Sandy resiliency. Olin was also one of the teams selected along with our partners at the University of Pennsylvania to examine a project over in the Bronx. And so there were a whole series of projects that were examining what needed to be done. And so this was a diagram, it was a gesture. It was a gesture that suggested very loosely that a line needed to be drawn. Where that line was, I think, has been very much up for debate. And those of you who attended the community board meeting the couple of weeks ago understand that where that line is really important for everybody to kind of understand and buy into. Next. So one of the things that I want to point out about Wagner Park that's quite unique, there were a team of really important people, Tessa Huxley, T. Eric Fleischer, who were in the Battery Park City Conservancy at the time of the building of Wagner Park. And one of the things that they had observed over the years of Battery Park City was the uneven drainage that occurred along the esplanade. Sometimes plants would drown, sometimes they wouldn't get enough water. And it was something that was very consistent. And so really beginning with Rockefeller Park, and then subsequently with Wagner Park, this was where this notion of making soils for urban places that would not be overcompacted when people walked on them, that would drain very well in the event of flooding and be usable right away. And so what we ended up doing was taking the fill that had been there and excavating about 6 feet of fill and coming back with a sand-based soil, a sand-based mix. So Wagner Park actually drains extraordinarily well. And if T weren't in Morocco, he would be reporting on the success and survivability, quite frankly, of Wagner Park during Sandy. The other thing that I want to note is that tremendous consideration was given to the plants. The splaying of those gardens from the esplanade back to the gardens was an important consideration. The plant selection, excuse me. So the plants that are out by the water are actually incredibly durable plants. And they were put there in order to withstand a lot of the salt spray and potential inundation from any kind of storm. Sorry, this is my second presentation today, and I think I'm losing my voice, but we'll keep going ahead. I apologize for the coughing here. Anyway, you can see how sandy these soils are. You can also see the consideration of the selection of plant material. Next, please. Okay. So what happened? Next. Brittany, would you like to take this one and then I'll come back on?
Sure,
If that's
sure, I'll
okay.
take this.
Thank you.
So I think we came to you guys with, here are the design principles that the community wants to see in a resiliency project. So these principles were outlined for this team and have been adopted actually for the Northwest project north of Battery Park City by the authority. And so the goal is to have the same design principles that have been adopted by the Northwest projects to be adopted for Wagner Park. Number one, minimal impact to the existing design, preserve the character of the park and the neighborhood. As you can see, it's a very special park and a very special neighborhood. So minimal disruption to the park, utilize existing structures. What I'll say is through this construction, even what you'll see on the alternate design, the park can remain open, use nature-based resiliency. I think Cindy walked you through how the current park already has elements of that built into it. And so ways that you can enhance that. Provide protection from all climate risks. So one of the things we asked was, can you also look at cloudburst flooding, not just flooding from the river, and be accretive to the neighborhood. In the Northwest project, when we went to the open house and there was a gentleman, Jeremy Siegel, from the big team. Afterwards, Kelly McGowan and I went up to him and we were talking, and he said, you know, if you finish a project and all you have is flood protection, that's a failure. When you think about resiliency, you need to think about a project that's accretive to a neighborhood. So that is a really, really important, I think, principle. In addition, the use of resiliency to increase active green space, which I think is very related to the being accretive to the neighborhood, especially considering the demographic of this neighborhood. Preservation of mature trees, and obviously prioritization of community needs and feedback in the designs and the design principles. I think that's really, really critical that you hear the feedback from the community and you integrate it into your designs. That is something that is paramount to this process. So these were the design principles that Cindy and Jeffrey's team took away.
That's great. Thank you, Brittany. Next, please.
They gave your voice a little rest too.
A little rest. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think many of you who have been involved in the conversations about resilience understand by now that resilience is not just about keeping the water out. It's a much deeper conversation. And actually, I think that one of the conversations that is missing still is the conversation about carbon and embedded carbon into projects and the demolition of projects and the rebuilding of projects and how much carbon we utilize. So really part of the game here is to reduce our carbon footprint. And so that's something that needs to be considered. These you've probably seen before are from the final EIS. They are the exploration of three alternatives for flood protection for the Wagner Park and Museum of Jewish Heritage area. Alternative one was reliant upon flip up deployables. Alternative 2 was out at the water and deemed to be technically infeasible. And alternative 3 was a buried wall. The interesting thing to us as we started to examine these alternatives, and those of us who are designers say that the devil's in the details. Alternative 1 really looked at, it seemed that we could tell from the documents, these pop-up deployables, but it didn't really look at other solutions. The other thing is it was quite dismissive of flooding of the park. Interestingly, parks have been designed to flood for quite some time. Frederick Law Olmsted, whose 200th anniversary of his birthday, was thinking about this stuff 150 years ago. It's pretty profound when we stop to think about it, that parks actually can flood. The concern was that it would be out of commission. It's hard to say how many days it would flood versus how many days construction of this new park would take, and how much longer it would be out of commission through flooding. Jeffrey is going to talk about the pavilion, so I will let him address that when we get to that. But I just want to point out, I think, to the audience that alternative 1 was viewed through a very narrow lens. So next, please. Working together with Jeffrey and with the neighborhood association, really the neighborhood association said, isn't there something we can do that could thread protection more delicately through the park? And so we took that to be our charge. Next, please. What you see here is this idea of threading a wall really between the allays of trees and the gardens that would offer the same protection that the revised proposed scheme is offering to the neighborhood. It doesn't mean that it's the same problem. Quite frankly, it's a slightly different problem. Yes, the gardens, the north and south garden, would have to have some removal of materials and be rebuilt. And yes, the excavation for that wall would be quite deep, much like the current scheme that has been proposed. It too would need a sheeting that runs down into the soil. And so we understand that this line, well, it looks quite delicate, has some real serious construction challenges that are not insurmountable, but it offers the possibility of retaining the integrity of the park and retaining the integrity of the street. What we're going to look at next, but before we go there, I just want to point out where these sections are cut that we're going to be looking at. So section A is to the north, out to the water. Section B is through the center of the pavilions, and section C is through the south gardens. And what we've done, next please, is to compare side by side the sections. So alternative 1A is the Olin Machado proposal, and alternative 3 is the project that is proposed and designed. One of the things that should jump out at everybody is the magnitude of fill that is going to be imported into the park by putting that wall out toward the water, as you can see in the red on alternative 3. And in order to maintain views from within the park to the Statue of Liberty, everything behind it has to be higher, at the same elevation or higher. I think the other thing that jumps out at one is the magnitude of the scale of the pavilion compared to what is there today. So a couple of other things that we know, we've consulted with some independent engineers who have a tremendous amount of credibility around sea level rise and the modeling that is behind sea level rise, and quite frankly, the behavior of waves as they come to these barriers. So the closer the barrier is to the water, the higher the barrier has to be because the wave can't dissipate. The further away the wall is from the water's edge, the wall can be slightly lower because in fact, the land acts as a dissipator of waves. You all see this at the beach, you know, you go to a sandbar and the waves break across the sandbar. In fact, that's what happens with the earth and the park. As I said, we understand that a sheeting will need to be placed down deep, so we don't want to pretend that there isn't some significant construction that will be required in order to implement this proposal. The other thing I want to say about this proposal is the way it's been designed is to tie into the proposal at Battery Park, and it is recognizing that there may need to be, if you could just go back one slide, please, there may need to be some modification as it wraps around the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And we're sort of less familiar with the details of the MJH proposal. I should also note that we also designed that landscape and are intimately familiar with it, and it holds similar principles to Wagner Park. So next, if we could move, yes. So the, you know, if we look at the principles that Brittany laid out in the beginning and measure performance against those principles, you can just graphically see that alternative 1A comes up with higher scores. Alternative 1 as proposed in the FEIS is even better. Alternative 3 does not do so well. And alternative 2 was not considered seriously here. So alternative 1, again, gives minimal impact and utilizes the existing park and structures. It promotes nature-based resiliency solutions, more green over concrete. And we also, Jeffrey and I, have ideas about adding additional green, for instance, in front of the plaza, in front of the pavilions at Battery Place, which he'll address in a moment. It is accretive to the neighborhood. It preserves the character of the park. It increases active green space and green infrastructure. There is the prioritization of the community needs as we understand them and has been explained to us through the neighborhood association and is beginning to integrate the community feedback. The mature trees are being preserved. And again, it's mitigating climate risks. Both reducing the heat index, is keeping our carbon footprint smaller by retaining the park, and it's reducing flooding from the river and the sky. Okay, next. So Jeffrey, I think it's important now for us to explain the mitigation proposals for the pavilions.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. So comprehensive. At the pavilions, we have a plan that incorporates that red line or the flood barrier into the structure of the pavilions themselves. I will mention in a moment how that can be achieved. Remember, these pavilions, they're quite unique, they're quite special. They also, the brickwork that is there was selected in the early 90s as a reminder of craft and the humanity of craft in a city that was then being rapidly built through industrial means that were shunning sort of human craft and production. They also have a reference to the sort of large scale brickwork and masonry work of the bridges, many of the bridges, such as the Brooklyn Bridge. And we really think it's important to preserve not just the views, but actually the character of these and the memories that they evoke. The wall or a flood barrier would be aligned really to the back side of the pavilions facing the street. At the gap or at the threshold through the pavilions, we can narrow the threshold. You see on the right, two small gray blocks, or two decently sized gray granite blocks that would reduce the effective width. That opening would be filled with manually deployable gates, or gates that are lifted and set into place when there is an impending flood that would seal the wall. Next slide. This, again, the barrier wall would be integrated into the backside of the pavilion, as is ghosted out here in the white on the left. I think the next slide will be helpful. And that barrier wall that's integrated into the pavilions will be directly integrated into the wall that extends down the alleyway and touches and connects to the barrier systems north and south of the park. The next slide. How do we do this? We will very likely need to demolish a portion or all of the stairs that are on the landward side of the pavilions so that we can rebuild them or a version of them with an integrated flood protection. These stairs could be rebuilt very similar or exactly as they are today. They could be redesigned. There could be new opportunities for engagement. There could be new opportunities for green space on the plaza, as is shown, improvements in accessibility, improvements of programmability. This is a really wonderful place to reimagine this portion of the park through community engagement process. It is also possible to expand the interior space underneath these stairs to get some of the additional square footage area that the AECOM proposed plan contemplates. The pavilions that are continue to be on the river side of the barrier would likely be hardened somewhat, but would essentially be floodable. In other words, in the event of a major storm, it would be assumed that that side of the barrier wall would flood. This is not atypical. There are other pavilions that are located in flood zones that are built of resilient material that will endure minimal disruption or minimal damage when there is a flood event. Any equipment, mechanical equipment, kitchen equipment, utilities would be on the landward side of the barrier, and thus protected from the sea level rise and from the wave action of a flood event. I think go back to Cindy and she can talk a little bit more about how the barrier would act in the landscape.
Sure. Next, please. So one of the questions is, how does this wall work? And as Jeffrey has said, this is not a pop-up wall. It is a permanent wall with openings in it. So this view is a view looking to the south garden with the wall put in place. And what we're trying to convey here is there are still apertures and openings, porosity from the street to the park, to the gardens. And we're also trying to convey that this wall does not have to be ugly. It can be very artful. It can be a surface that is conducive to an art installation. We've shown one here, sort of a riff on Beautiful Wall. So an artist that we're working with on the other coast. It could be a mural it can be lots of things. It does not have to be an ugly wall. This is what I mean when I say, really, the devil's in the details. How we think about this is really important. Now, when we look at the North Garden from, next please, from the inside of the park, so we're now looking out toward Battery Place. And again, you can see the openings that are there today are maintained on the right and sort of to the, just to the right of the woman in the foreground. This wall could be a green wall. These gardens are very garden-esque. They could have espalier plants on them. There are any number of things we can think about. So we're excited. We think that the wall, again, can be part of the feature, part of the celebration of place. Next. So we have lots of feedback that we've received so far. We do think that this does provide minimal impacts to the unique character of the park, preservation of the heart and soul of the Battery Park City community, our community's gem. It preserves the unique characters of the neighborhood. It integrates community feedback and opportunities to further iterate. It's an opportunity to increase active green space, an opportunity to add green space to prevent flooding from increased microburst events and flooding from those events. It's a preservation of mature trees and critical green infrastructure that's already in the park and protects from increasing heat, especially by being more carbon conscious. It is a prioritization of green over concrete. The implementation of this park could be faster than demolishing and rebuilding, providing protection even sooner than what the current proposal is. And I think it's really important that the design principles that are being embraced in the Battery and Northwest projects are can actually be applied to Wagner Park and given the same due and the same consideration. So next, please. Brittany and Kelly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cindy and Jeffrey, Taylor, and to the whole team. You know, one thing I think we have some questions that have come in and we're going to ask, but I did want to, you know, just say, when you think about the authority's plan, right, that they are going to be demolishing a park, you know, all you have to look to is East River Park, to what it's going to look like for 2 years, right, with almost no protection for those 2 years. You know, from any storm event or rain event. So we're going to be left for a few years with zero protection. Kelly, do you want to MC the questions now that have come in through the chat?
Yes, thanks, Brittany, and thanks to Cindy and Jeffrey for fantastic work and presentation. The way we're going to handle questions for those on the line, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A button, and we will consolidate them. So some of the questions I'm going to ask are actually reworded and paraphrased to consolidate many questions that came in. So if they don't exactly match yours, you know, I apologize for that. First question we have is, do you have any construction time and cost estimates of the design relative to the BPCA design? I think, Cindy, you actually answered that at the end of the presentation.
Right. And, you know, again, this has not been fully designed. It's a concept that is out there. There are many things that happen between now and construction. First of all, there has to be buy-in. There would likely need to be another go at the permitting process. And then there's the actual design. And then there is the construction time. It's very difficult for us to estimate these precisely. In an ideal world, if we didn't have all those other hurdles to go through, it could be potentially a 12-month to 16-month project. But again, there are many elements that need to be considered. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Cindy has said. I think we could look at it precisely, or we could also look at it relatively to the plan that is currently moving forward, which is substantially larger and than the one that we're putting on the table tonight. And I think it's relatively safe to say that it should be cheaper and faster than the plan that's on the table.
Great, thanks. Another question that's probably top of everybody's mind is, do you think that your proposal would be as flood resistant in the long term as the current plan? Cindy, you want to take that one?
Sure. It would be as flood resistant. One of the things that you all talked about was the idea that as the science improves, we can crisp up or modify the solution and build onto it. So once you build it, it doesn't have to be done. There can be modifications made. So it definitely provides the resilience that and flood protection that the current plan provides. And in many ways, perhaps even more so when we consider cloudburst flooding.
So great, that actually answers the second question, which was, would this plan be adaptable in the future? So I think that answers that one.
Yeah.
I think,
Fantastic.
Cleta, maybe you want to just pull up the wall, maybe to make sure that everyone sees what you're saying, is that the wall height itself can be
That's right.
adjusted quite easily. Maybe just go show that. Yeah. So instead of having to rebuild and redemolish and raise a park, which, you know, they're building the flood wall inside the park. So if they need to go higher, it would be a whole other new project, essentially. Here, it's just an addition on top of the wall.
I think you touched on this too, Cindy, but we have a question under each plan for the park. What protection from flooding would be in place during the construction period?
Okay, that's a great question, and I have to say I haven't, during the construction period, what protection would be in place? Well, it's really the presence of the park itself. And I want to point out to everybody that the high point of the park is up at elevation 13. And again, if T were on the phone, on this call, he would reiterate how well Wagner Park itself did. The vulnerability, the low point, and where water comes in is actually over by Pier A. That is the most critical and urgent area in need of protection. And we've modeled this. We have an animation. My colleague, I see, who has joined us, Evan, has my name next to his face because he's on my link, I guess, but he modeled all of this. He modeled how the waters actually entered Lower Manhattan during the Sandy floods.
Great, thank you. I know this question has come in many forms. What kind of construction inconveniences will the neighborhood face with this plan versus the BPCA's?
Well, it's hard to know everything with the BPCA plan, but what we do know, as I pointed out before, there are just enormous amounts of fill So they're going to be an enormous number of trucks moving back and forth, or if their plan is to deliver that bill by barge, those are details that I just am not privy to at this point. One of the things is it would be possible for I want to say the lawn side of the gardens, everything to the west of the gardens and in front of the pavilions, potentially to stay open. Obviously, maneuverability is something that would need to be examined. You know, as designers, we're always told not to get too deep into means and methods. And this is the case where certainly a construction manager could help develop a plan to minimize disruption and to keep large portions of the park open to the public.
Great, thanks. I know this is another one that comes up a lot is, will this plan save the mature trees, or does it require trees to be cut down?
Yeah, you know, this is the intention of this plan is that it will save the mature trees. The way the soil profiles for those maples were designed was really from LA to LA. There's structural soil. And the beds are of sufficient size. The goal would be to leave those beds alone and intact and to not disrupt those mature trees. And there are other trees in the park, those obviously would stay as well.
Great, thank you. Here's a quick question. What design flood elevation is proposed for the wall?
Sure. So we took the elevation off of the Battery Park wall elevation, which is 18.5. We use that elevation. And again, keeping in mind what I explained before and what our engineers talked to us about was the wave run up and the ability of the waves to dissipate if the wall is further back. And so that's why you're seeing a 2-foot differential. As everybody knows, there is a lot of controversy over the exact models that are being used and the information that is out there. We didn't want to challenge that at this moment. So we used what is being utilized for the Pier A and Battery Park City height, and didn't want to go down that rabbit hole because that's not what this is about, right? We don't think the precise height is what this is about.
Great, but maybe a detail on that, because I think the 18.5 is above sea level. What would somebody's life experience be? So currently, I think the hedges are about 4 feet. So what would this wall be?
Sure. Okay. So you're right. That 18.5 is above sea level. So if you were walking down between the LAs, you're at roughly elevation 12. So the wall is about 6.5 feet tall, 7 feet tall. If you're inside of the LAs, if you're in the gardens, you know, one of the interesting things about the gardens is the gardens themselves are actually slightly depressed in the original design in order to create a slight microclimate. And so the wall from the garden side would be slightly appear or would feel slightly higher because of that very slight depression. But we're talking, folks, we're talking about a foot. We're not talking about multiple feet here.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions on the pavilion itself. One is, can the existing pavilion be hardened to provide flood protection?
Yep, sure. Yeah, it can, but the benefit of this solution is that by threading the barrier wall through essentially between the pavilion and the steps, and with the ability to actually have interior space underneath the steps, we can install interior flood doors, basically, where we can separate all of the critical equipment and put the critical equipment on the safe side of the wall. This means that on the flood prone side of the pavilion, these will basically be resilient. They could continue to be the restrooms, which could have resilient materials in them, and also the dining area for the cafe, which can be designed with resilient material and furniture in the case of flooding.
Great, and a related question on the stairs: will the selective demolition of the stairs impact the structural integrity of the pavilion? And what modifications would they need to be made to make it passive flood resistant? I think you asked,
Right.
you answered the second one. So
right. I think there's another question also, Kelly, about why do the stairs need to be demolished in order to provide this flood protection at the pavilion? And the answer to that question is in the other question, which is that we need some distance from the footprint of the pavilion proper in order to excavate and install the sheeting that is required to be continuous below grade, as Cindy's shown in her sections, as well as act as a foundation for the flood barrier wall that would be hidden within the architecture, within the finished architecture. The current finished architecture of the pavilion is not designed to be a flood barrier wall. We need to insert one and thread one through the existing building.
okay, great, thanks. I know this question is very important to many people in the community, and especially with families. Does the park have to be closed during the construction?
I don't believe that it does. Again, I think that the lawns can remain open by selectively fencing the north and south gardens. I think construction access needs to be examined. There's a lot of precious stuff in front of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And so that piece needs to be examined, where the trucks are coming and going from, or whether, again, materials are being brought in by barge. But through the process of fencing, I would feel quite confident in saying that a good portion of the park can remain open.
Great, thanks. One question is that was a concern, especially for people who live through Sandy. If the battery floods and the water comes from the east, like it did in Sandy, would this structure withstand it?
Well, yes. The goal here, though, is that the battery has also conformed and built their wall. And again, where a lot of the water came from was at that low point at Pier A. That is the most vulnerable spot in this plan. And that needs to be taken care of promptly.
Great. A question on how the sight lines that people are familiar with and love today, how are they affected in this design? Which ones remain and which ones are lost or affected?
Sure. So I don't know if we can pull up the rendered plan again, or you can actually see the one behind me maybe. But if we could just take a quick look at that, because this, not this, but the plan, even the plan with the wall would be sufficient. Okay, so where the way the wall is drawn is where it is thick is a permanent, roughly 7-foot high wall from finished grade. Where it is thin are the current walkways moving from the LAs into the gardens. Those openings would remain, and again, in the event of a flood, manual gates would be placed in there, much like Jeffrey described at the pavilions. And this is something that happens along just about every great river that I work along. So it's not a novel idea. So the sight lines would be through those pathways that are moving from the LA to the gardens, two on the north, one between the pavilions, and roughly 2 or 3. I understand that on the south side, the maintenance yard, this is something that we understood programmatically needed to be removed. So I want to say again, it's a little bit unclear what will happen in that section, but I would say a minimum of 2 access points would remain, and it's possible that a third one might be added.
Great. A related question. Have the walls proposed been proven in real life scenarios to be strong enough to withstand major storm flooding? I assume that's a question of, is this a proven technology or is this novel?
No, it's a proven technology, and the wall would be designed to withstand the flooding. That it would have to be engineered. And again, everybody's work here is pro bono, including the engineers. So this is something that would definitely require a very serious and, a team of individuals to design it to the standards that would endure and withstand the flooding.
Thank you. Here's a question on ADA compliance and DOB. Do changes on the pavilion that are needed trigger Department of Building rules that mean further changes would need to be made to make the building more ADA compliant? I'm not sure that it's out of ADA compliance, but they're always updating those. So that's a good question.
Yeah, it's a good question. One that would be looked into, in particular with relationship to the elevator that does provide access to the roof deck right now. We'd want to look at that and make sure that it is appropriate and ADA compliant to make sure that people can access the roof and the tremendous views that are from that terrace.
Great. Question on the future of tide flooding. Please elaborate on the park flooding over the projected time horizon and sea level rise and climate change. Would there be high tide flooding on the park? What would be the flood recovery time? I guess, the first part of that question, I'd probably say that's unanswerable by you guys, probably more the modelers, but probably the question on the flood recovery time. Could you comment on the design?
Or Clayda's on too, that she can comment on the model.
I was going to say Clayda can chime in on the modeling.
Well, a couple of things that I just want to point out. When we designed Wagner Park, ironically, there was this desire to get people close to the water. So the nose, what we call the nose of the park, where section B is coming through at the water, that piece of the esplanade was actually lowered because the authority and Stephanie Gelb and Susan Kaplan, Tony Wu, everybody wanted to get closer to the water. So the most vulnerable part here is the nose. That could go underwater more frequently and would, obviously, because it is lower. That is a vulnerable spot. The recovery time, again, because of the sand profile, is very rapid. The park drains like a dream. And again, I think Sandy is our kind of our test case. It doesn't mean that there won't be more intense storms. It doesn't mean that there won't be sunny day flooding in the future. But it is designed to drain quite rapidly.
Can I just add, T was actually texting me from Morocco today because I was asking him some questions. And he added a few things, which is number one, remember in Hurricane Sandy, there was $1,000 worth of plant damage from the storm. What him and the team did was that they flushed the plants and the trees before the storm. The storm, had some salt water. The plants sustained, some brackish water, and then they went and flushed them afterwards. And he stressed not one tree died during Sandy. And the plants that sustained the damage were hydrangeas, largely hydrangeas. And those plants, what happened was that actually they couldn't sustain the flushing after the storm. They weren't used to so much water. So that's where the damage was. So again, $1,000 in the Hurricane Sandy of damage was what actually Wagner Park sustained. All the millions of dollars you hear about is in Pier A, ball fields from the east. So.
Great. I'm going to lump a couple of questions that have come in regarding the deployables. How many are there? How they affect egress and access for safety reasons for the park, as well as how are they operated manually, passively, or mechanically?
So there would need to be roughly 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, possibly 8 of these gates. And we imagine that they are manually installed. But again, the wall would need to be engineered. And there was another part to your question, Kelly, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there was a specific question on how does egress pathways change? And would this increase or decrease the emergency egress in any way?
I think that's an interesting question, right? One of the things about flooding is it's not instant. It can happen quite quickly, but there is typically a lot of time for evacuation. And so we didn't really think that was so much of an issue. We think that can be managed quite seamlessly.
But maybe I'll follow up to that. Is my understanding is that the entrances and exits of the current park remain the same, or they're more or less?
They do. They do.
Okay.
Yes, they remain the same, and they would only be closed up in the event of a threatening flood. Yes.
Right. Okay, great.
Yeah.
One question I actually think is interesting comparison question. I'm sure you won't know the answer to it, but it's on the list if we, when the comparison is there. What is the comparison amount of the cement needed between the plans? Right, because I know that people who are very climate sensitive understand that concrete is one of the biggest sources of carbon emissions.
Absolutely. Well, the precise answer to that would have to be done with a carbon calculator with area takeoffs, and Pamela Conrad developed the carbon calculator, which is a very effective tool, and that study could be done. But I can tell you there's a whole lot more carbon in the proposed plan that is about to be built.
Okay. This also is just, I think, a really good question that's probably not answerable tonight. A federal agency recently, that's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I'm sure they're referring to, announced a plan to install flood walls at the foot of the Hudson. If that plan is constructed, would it obviate resiliency efforts in Battery Park City?
Oh, well, so as I understood it, that was one option, one location. And I'm not sure of the status of that. I'm probably not the best one to comment, but I would imagine.
I think one of those plans, if it goes through, it's the HATS project, I believe 3A. If that goes through, then you don't need to deal with storm surge, essentially. Yeah. The proposed project that is 3B is
would require Battery Park City to do their own, as well as all the way up the west side, as I understand it. But it's still open for feedback of which plan is going to move forward, and it's likely not going to happen for a very long time.
And also, just for everybody on the call, they should realize that that is in a comment period that's been issued. They're looking for a comment period. I believe it closes in January.
Yeah.
So if you're interested, by all means, read it and comment on the proposals that you like. Okay. You did touch on this, but specifically a question on how cloudburst flooding is helped in this plan.
Sure. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that T said is at some point during Sandy, they realized that they were going to, by putting up sand barriers, they're actually going to trap the water in rather than let it go out. And at some point, they decided to take those barriers out so that water could flow out. Obviously, this is one of the questions here. How will water flow out? And it could flow out through any one of those openings. This is obviously water is going to flow downhill. And so what it would do is it would flow smack into the gardens and the garden areas that are slightly depressed. That would be the first place to fill up if water was being relieved from the Battery Place side. It's a great question because I think the question is going to present itself with every single time a wall is being built. What is that cloudburst flooding? Anybody who's been to Taipei understands that oftentimes there's more flooding inside the wall than there is outside. So it's quite a serious issue that needs to be understood, not just locally, but holistically.
Thank you. Probably a question for Jeffrey. The BPCA has said that the Pavilion building has suffered salt and water damage and requires rebuilding. Does the alternative plan assume or require reconstruction to harden it for flooding?
I think they're, as part of a project that would touch the pavilions, the design team would want to look at any deterioration that the pavilion has suffered in its skin or its brick, and then in its structure, sort of separately, to determine the needs to do any kind of remediation for the work. But again, the strategy here is that everything that is on the river side of this red line in the pavilions is floodable, and we can do assessments, or assessments can be done about damage that may be done under certain storm conditions, given the current sort of condition of the pavilions, or given a hardened condition of the buildings. As a note, the plan that is currently going forward just demolishes them altogether and rebuilds new ones. We believe that there is integrity in the pavilions to save, in the carbon sequestering that Cindy's already mentioned, but also in the materials that are currently in place.
Great. Separate topic, interesting question. Lucinda mentioned Wagner Park may be eligible for landmark designation. Is this something the BPCNA has looked into? And I can handle that, or I don't know if you can comment on it, Brittany, but what we know is that the actual eligibility for Wagner Park has been determined. There's a whole series of process that has to go through, given the age of the park and its determination. So that has not been completed, but obviously we have to save it first. So I would say from our point of view is, first mission is to save the park, and then the second mission is to get it designated so that it isn't under perpetual threat from some future developers. I think that's true, should be true of all downtown parks, and parks in general, but if anybody has anything to add to that, I agree.
Elliot, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe there's commentary on this in the FEIS that they say, for instance, with option 3, that the designation is not feasible because obviously everything's going to be demolished. So it is commented upon in the FEIS.
Right, that is true, because there won't be anything to landmark.
Right.
Great, we're getting down to the end. I'm going to lump a couple of questions and maybe turn it over to Brittany for, but let's do a couple technical ones first. This plan only shows Wagner Pier A still floods, and what are the wall thicknesses?
I'm sorry,
So the first question is this, what happens at the intersection of Pier A? Is there any consideration to Pier A? Because that's still flooding. And I think for the audience, we should all know that Pier A is a designated historical landmark, federal landmark. So any treatment of that building per se has to be gone through federal approval for that, which is one of the reasons why it's off most plans for now.
Yep.
But
well, the way we managed this concept is to say we would tie into whatever proposals are being put forth for protection of that low point. And I might be wrong about this, but I didn't think Pier A itself was being protected. I thought the landward side of Pier A was where the barrier was going. But if I've misunderstood that, we just need to look at that more closely.
No,
But
Pier A is going to flood. The actual building is going to flood. You're absolutely correct. There are some walls that it's a mix of wall with deployables on top. And so this plan will connect in. So there's a seamless connection between what's planned. And then they have a wall that essentially goes all the way up kind of around the battery. And then this plan will connect to what is being proposed for the Jewish Museum around the Jewish Museum. We didn't ask for a whole redesign of the whole project. We just asked for the park part to keep the green space.
right.
great. Just let me get just running through here. One question is, so who's moving the 10 to 15 ton concrete walls when they need to go in? Where are they stored at the meantime? Maybe you could comment on the size and weight of the deployables and how big of a deal those are.
Yeah, this is well beyond the consideration of this proposal at this time. And again, I just want to say that those inserts may not be concrete. They may be metal inserts, as they are along great portions of the Ohio River, for instance. So we will, again, this is an engineering question that is being asked, and I do not want anybody to think that I am an engineer, but I am very much in conversation with them. And if this is a question we need to get back to somebody on, I am certainly more than happy to enlist the services of our engineers again. And where they would be stored, I don't know. This is going to be a pretty important question for any of the iterations, not just at Wagner Park, but all the way from the north down to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. There are multiple techniques and strategies that are being considered. And that's the storage of these is a great question.
Okay, great, thanks. And one is Lucinda, please address again why future reinforcements would ever be needed if the revised plan provides the same protection. What percent protection, second question is, what percent protection is the revised plan estimated to provide? 50, 80, or 90? I think the answer is whatever the current plan is designated to provide in the models, but do we happen to know that, either you or Lisa or Cleta?
Or Cleta?
Yeah, so we're going with 18 and hi everyone. This is Cleta Vega speaking. So this designs are going with 18.5 foot elevation, which is exactly the same as what the BPCA designs are. And they are designed for the 100-year storm surge plus the predicted sea level rise through 2050.
Right, but I think they did have a confidence level interview.
Yes, and then they have wave top up and everything else. So it's not just barely there. But this is, both plants are going for the same elevation.
Right, but do you happen to know what that confidence level is? 50, 80, or 90? I don't.
Well, the table that they have goes all the way up to 2050, but they added so much, extra that will certainly see us through to 100 years from now. And then again, this is the beauty of this plan. These are just projections, which they actually are going to revise very soon. And the sea level rise projections don't match the IPCC projections, which are lower, and don't match NOAA projections, which are also lower. So the beauty of this plan is that it's very flexible.
So that's a way to answer the first part of the question is, why would future reinforcements ever be needed? This plan provides some flexibility if needed, but it's not anticipated.
That's right.
Right.
That is
great.
correct.
Perfect. Again, back to deployables, how does the number of deployables in this plan compare to the BPCA plan?
So maybe the best thing to do is to kind of look at the sections again, if we could, because the BPCA plan doesn't really have deployables. The whole slide 21, the whole concept is on the left-hand side here, that protection is buried under the landscape. So you will never see it in the form of a wall, and it will not need to be deployed.
Though you guys weren't asked to look at any of the other plans, but PRA, the pinch point, like the low point, is using deployables, and same with the Jewish Museum. And then if anyone attended the Northwest Open House, there's deployables planned all the way up, throughout the whole Battery Park Resiliency Project. There's also deployables in the recently completed ball fields. And my understanding is in the East River Park, there's really large deployables actually that they're leveraging for East River Park resiliency projects. So it's kind of a standard thing. I don't know, counting the entrances and exits just off the top of my head, feels like about 5 or 6 deployables would be added. But there's going to be a lot of them throughout Battery Park as you get to the northwest.
Great. I think one of the last questions specifically for Cindy and Jeffrey is, would a new environmental impact statement be required or study be required, and how long? Do you have an estimate of how long that would take?
This is all a great question. And again, we haven't delved into that aspect. But one of the interesting things, as I've said before, the devil's in the details. This actually is a different version of option 1. So I don't know that a whole study would need to be reinitiated all over again, the whole study, or whether a variation of that option 1 would suffice in comparison with the other options that were looked at, option 2 and option 3.
Great.
Yeah, and in the last one, Kelly, took about 5 months. So if you had to create a whole new one, going from the draft to the final, it was 5 months, right? But you don't obviously have to rewrite the whole thing.
Right,
But-
so you would expect it to take less time, or no more than that time. Great. I think for now, that's all the questions. The remaining questions really aren't for the design team. They're really about what are the next steps, and has this been communicated among various planning groups and committees? What is the BPCA stance on this, and how would we work with them to get them to take a look at this? What will be the process in getting this plan to replace the current BPAs? And they're all great questions, but they're this is so thoughtful. Thank you. How will the BPCNA try to engage the BPCA and city officials around these new plans? Is the impending demolition on hold? Brittany, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, we've heard that they're waiting till after the election. That's the rumor, is they realize how unpopular the current plan is. We did give our elected officials a preview yesterday on this alternate design. And, the communication that I've started saying is, I think the community is going to really widely support this new plan. And people are going to expect that our elected officials support us in getting a redesign. People are incredibly unhappy with the current design. So that is the goal. Everyone's been sending. We've probably had about over 2,000 unique people email, over 5,000 emails at least, going to elected officials so far. Continue emailing on savewagner.com. There's an easy to email button, and tell the elected officials, we need to demand that they support the community's ask, right? We're not asking, every single person might not to support, but it's a democracy, and we have to go with democracy with majority rules. And that's the way that America works, and our community should work. And we expect the officials to do that. So through the voices of many, not a few, is how we're going to do that. The next step is what's tentatively planned is for a week from today, next Thursday, is to host a rally for those in support of the alternate design, and to come together and again have our officials come out publicly and support us. You can't support one plan. You can't support both plans. You can't support the community and support the plan as is. You have to support one plan or another plan. And it's really going to be the voices of the masses that will get that. I would say continue to go to savewagner.com. We will keep the information fluid of what the next steps are and how the community can continue to support. The last piece is legal action is not off the table. So we are going to be placing a button to donate to our legal fund front and center. And if we have to take legal action to get meaningful consideration to this alternate design, then we will do that as well. So, but we hope that it doesn't have to get to that. And so again, I really can't thank this team enough for coming to our aid to come up with this alternate design. You can see how thoughtful, how much time that they spent, how thoughtful, how they even use their networks to get questions answered pro bono, again, 100% pro bono. And, you know, they gave us this park, this gem, you know, really, in some cases, the whole Battery Park City campus, right? Which we love and why we all live here and move here or move close to it. And it's worth protecting and preserving. So we thank you guys. We thank everyone in the community for listening. And we really hope that our elected officials heed our call.
Great, and thank you. So just to end, next steps, people should go to Wagner.com for more information and ways that you can help in sending messages to our elected officials. Also, Brittany, what should people do if they either come up with another question or we weren't able to get to their question tonight?
You should email hello@bpcna.org. Any question, we will work diligently to try to put some pen to paper on some of these questions and post them. But you can email us at hello@bpcna.org and we will answer your question.
With that, thank you to the team. Thank you to the hundreds of people who were logged on to watch this. I know it was 90 minutes, but I hope it was worth it, and look forward to hearing from people.
Thank you. Thank you, Taylor,
Thank you.
Jeffrey, Cindy, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.